You may recall seeing these QAnon flags and T-shirts at last month's storming of the U.S. Capitol. It's a disproven and discredited far-right conspiracy theory that makes some pretty wild allegation. QAnon conspiracy theorists believe that a secret cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles is running a global child sex trafficking ring, and Donald Trump has been fighting to protect the world from that group, which believers allege includes some high-profile U.S. politicians. But with the Trump presidency now fading into history, some of the movement's former believers are now trying to get their lives back again, turning to online support groups and even to therapy. It begs the question, why is it so hard for some to change their minds about deeply held beliefs, even when they're presented with facts? Our next guest is here to help us understand that. Dr. Ziv Cohen is a forensic psychiatrist. He's also a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry and an expert on extremist beliefs at Cornell University. Thank you for joining us here on Canada Tonight.
Good to be here.
So, it's interesting because maybe some people who believe this wouldn't consider themselves extremists. But I want to also begin by asking you, this issue of conspiracy theories isn't exclusive to Trump or QAnon. I think probably a lot of us right now know at least one person in our lives who deeply believes some conspiracies around maybe COVID-19 or the vaccines, for example. And yet it's very difficult to counter those narratives with facts or science. Why is that?
Well, I think that with conspiracy theories, people are espousing them because of the emotional purpose that they serve. And so if you try to counter conspiracy theories with brute fact, that tends to not work. It actually tends to shut the person down and actually turn them off.
Yeah, I guess, you could almost say, it's the same discussion could be had with people who hold any religious beliefs, right? That some could, people wouldn't be able to argue with them with facts or science.
Sure, I think that there's a similarity to religion in the sense that these beliefs are fulfilling an emotional function. One function is they provide a source of knowledge. So when the world is very complicated and we have complicated things like global warming or the COVID pandemic, and you really need to understand a fair amount of science to really understand why these things are happening, then a conspiracy theory gives you a really neatly packaged idea of what knowledge might look like about why these things are happening. That makes people feel safer to have these explanations and to feel like they understand what's going on. And it also makes them feel bonded with others. So it makes you feel good about the group that you belong to. You belong to a special group that knows the truth. So it has a positive social function for those people. So for those reasons, they cling to it pretty strongly. And you can't just talk them out of it by presenting them with critical facts and science.
So now, particularly with QAnon, now that Trump has been removed from office, it kind of changes the narrative a little bit. And I think it seems like there's kind of two camps. People who have either digged their heels in further and people who have now taken a step back and said, okay, well, maybe I've been, taken for a ride. You've had some previous supporters of QAnon come to you. So what are you hearing from them about how they got sucked in and why they're now ready to go?
Well, I think that with conspiracy theories and QAnon, it's kind of a slippery slope. So you kind of have three groups. You have the first group is people who will sort of lightly dabble in a conspiracy theory. So they might hear about QAnon and think it sounds kind of cute, kind of interesting. They might read some articles, but they're not really spending a lot of time on this. It's not really going into their core identity. And then you have people who over time really become much deeper adherents of this and really starts to shape their worldview, and their thinking can become very wrapped up in the conspiracy. And then things like just things that are happening in their daily life, like what's the explanation for COVID or what's the explanation for the economy, all of it will get sucked into a conspiracy theory. And then from there, you have people who really go into the fringe core of a conspiracy, where they're so wrapped up in a conspiratorial narrative that it really becomes quite a paranoid worldview. And those people are at risk for violence, like we saw with some of the Capitol rioters. Not all of them were QAnon adherents, but some of them were. And those are the people that you worry about in terms of violence. So I think what I've generally seen in my clinical practice is people who maybe started out as conspiracy theory light adherents. They thought it was cute. They thought it was interesting. They have some skepticism of mainstream media. And then over time, they got sucked more and more. They may have been influenced by a boyfriend or a family member. And over time, this really kind of dominated their thinking. And so I think for those people being snapped back into reality, the fact that Trump did not win the election, Biden was sworn in, there was no great reckoning like they expected would happen, where they thought that Trump would order the military to arrest Biden and Obama and the Clintons. And when they saw that that didn't happen and we now have a new president, for those people, they're not so far in that they were not able to realize that they've been had. Right. So for them, it's a real crisis to think about, how did this happen to me? How did I go so deep, so far? They're reassessing relationships. They're reassessing whether they can trust their own mind and their own thoughts. So it's quite a journey they have to take now to get out of this, wreckage of QAnon.
Some I had described trying to leave the process as kicking a drug addiction. So when people like this come to you, how do you support them?
Well, I think drug addiction is a great analogy. We've all heard of those famous experiments with mice where they will push the lever to get the cocaine rather than food or water, because the cocaine feeds the dopamine in their brain. And I think that social media triggers dopamine release, clicking away and seeing things that are stimulating to you. And now when you supercharge the social media with a really juicy conspiracy theory, I think that there is a really good analogy to be made with drug addiction, that people really get addicted to reading more and more posts about their favorite conspiracy theory. So I think that, look, if you have someone who's come to you and they realize they have a problem, then that's a great asset, because now you already have someone that you can talk to and help walk them through the biased thinking, the lack of critical thinking, the way their emotions got the better of them, the way usually fear and anxiety have driven them to believe in a conspiracy theory that's not realistic. So I think, the path can be quite clear to, in a sense, deprogramming these people. I think what can be a tougher challenge is when you have a loved one or a family member that's still in the conspiracy theory, and how do you keep an open channel of communication with them without endorsing their beliefs, but also without ridiculing them, because then they're just going to shut you out. They're not really going to want to communicate with you anymore, and then you really lost the battle, because they're no longer able to talk to you and maybe hear a different point of view. So I think for those people, using empathy is really important. I think you want to be empathic. If you're talking to someone who's espousing a conspiracy theory, for example, if they tell you COVID is fake news, it's a made-up story, I think you don't want to say, well, Dr. Fauci presented the science, right, and you're stupid that you don't believe Dr. Fauci. You want to say, I understand how scary COVID is, and I also sometimes feel it would be great if it was all just fake news.
Right. Dr. Ziv Cohen, this is such a fascinating conversation. I'm sorry I have to cut it short, but thank you so much for your time.
Great.